Um, so thanks all for being here. I'm currently a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. And I'm gonna chat with you guys about some of the work that I do. I make audio stories, usually about the environment. And this is where I was living before I came to Cambridge. This is Banff National Park in Canada. Has anyone been to the Canadian Rockies? No? Okay, so this is like where I was living, and this is where I was making podcasts, radio documentaries, and features for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, NPR, and all of them are on environment-related topics. So I have worked in cities. I have done like daily news reporting across Canada at various Canadian Broadcasting Corporation stations. But more recently, over the past like 4+ years, this is what my office often looks like. I go out into the field with biologists. This photo was taken in July 2018. I was on a mountain range called the Heart Mountains in northeastern British Columbia. And so we had to helicopter into this location. You can't hike in, you can't drive in, it's really remote. So I was there for a few days with a group of biologists, and so you can see I've come prepared. I have like my field recorder, which is here. Ken there has like a lav mic on him, and then I also have my microphone that has like the big wind blimp and dead wombat for the wind. I have my bear spray because it's bear country. So I'm prepared. I have my rain gear, my wind gear, but some things you can't predict when you're out in the field, like how much rain there's gonna be or how much wind or how much fog. And so after a few days, our helicopter is supposed to land to pick us up, and the weather's too bad. It can't. Like it's so foggy, we can't see any of the other mountains. I can't even see like a tent that's like 3 feet away from me. So the helicopter cannot land, and we're stranded. And so that's one of the hazards of the job. This is the tent I was telling you that I am responsible for trashing. This was the result of that night in the wind and rain. The tent did not survive. We were all okay, fortunately. And it made my reporting from that area a little bit more interesting, because I actually had some sort of unpredicted events that had happened out there. And so most of the stories I tell about the environment are about things that cannot speak for themselves. So these are some of my subjects. Grizzly bears, right? You can't interview a grizzly. I can't, I need to find another way to tell a story about insects or fossils or stuff that's even more abstract, like ecosystems or climate change. You need to find like creative ways to make people engage with those topics. And so that's a challenge of the work that I do. And so what I'm going to chat with you about today are 5 approaches that I take to bring these subjects that cannot speak to them for themselves to life through audio. And so I've divided them into like 5 tips, and I have some audio clips to play. But feel free to ask questions like after each clip and stuff. We can save some questions for the end too, but feel free to jump in. So the first thing that I try and do is go where the action is. And so the first clip I'm gonna play is actually from the Heart Mountains. So the photos I showed you of like me with Ken on the mountain and like my flattened tent, this is from that trip. And so we had some unexpected weather that held us in camp for 2 extra days, but we also had some unexpected guests in the camp as well. We'll see if the audio will work. Oh, good.
After hours of work, it's late afternoon when we near the ridge of the mountain.
Oh, did you hear yelling?
Claudia thinks she hears yelling from over the ridge in the valley, where the rest of the group is working near base camp.
I think there's probably a bear. They're behaving like it's a bear.
They are?
Yeah.
Well, find it. You've got binoculars. Darren just thinks they're behaving as though they're trying to shoo something away. And there aren't very many things you want to do that to. Black or grizzly? Oh, I see them. They're in the little light area above the rock outcrop.
We see a mother grizzly bear and her 2 yearlings. They're meandering through the valley. Darren radios one of the scientists, Rob Bennett, who's down at camp.
Rob, it's Darren. Can you guys see them?
Yeah, we can see 3. We have a mom and 2 cubs west of the camp. Are you on the ridge line?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're on the ridge. We heard some yelling, so we came over the edge.
The bears are kind of sauntering away from camp, except one of the cubs is stubborn and heading toward camp. Darren suggests we yell at the same time to help scare them away for good.
Go bear! Go bear!
The bears run out of the valley. Claudia and Darren decide their collecting is over.
Okay. So has anyone ever hiked or camped in grizzly bear country? No? Okay. It worked. They like went, yeah, it's, they're actually like, you could easily sort of scare them away. Sometimes they just like don't know you're there. So fortunately it worked because, you know, you're in a really vulnerable spot out there. But why I've played this clip is because I had the opportunity to go where the action was, right? Like I could have interviewed these scientists about their work out here in the field. They're out there to gather like bugs and plants to bring back to the museum where they work. But it's more interesting to go there and see how it's done because they ran into a lot of hazards in the field, like the weather, the bears through camp. So that sort of ultimately gave me a bit of a structure for my field reporting, which I wouldn't have had I just like interviewed them, you know, back at the museum or something like that. And so when I'm going to where the action is, like when I'm going out in the field, I'm recording all the time. And I'm using a field recorder that allows me to plug in a couple of microphones. And so I always have a microphone like on a person, like a lav mic, like the one I'm wearing. And I also am carrying like my big directional microphone. Well, sorry, it's not actually that big, but it's in the like big wind cage because I'm often places where it's like super, super windy. And so because I'm recording the whole time and I'm getting like 2 tracks of audio, I'm taking notes to keep track of like where things are. But I'd rather have too much than too little because if I've missed the action, I mean, you can't recreate that, right? So it's like, yeah, it's important to be recording if you have like an opportunity to go where the action is because unexpected things can make your story and your reporting more compelling. Yeah. So this is another example of going where the action is. This is a clip from a documentary I made about bears for a CBC radio program called Ideas. And in this clip, I'm talking to a biologist named Michael Proctor. He works in the Creston Valley in southern British Columbia. So that's like just north of the Idaho border. And he's working in an area that's this beautiful mountain valley, but there's also like ranch land and farmland, and then there's these grizzlies trying to pass through. And so he's trying to figure out like where these grizzlies are going.
They know a bear is close, so they bring out the telemetry gear.
That deer is pretty close.
Are we closer to her than we were at the farm?
Yeah, way closer. So you can hear that sharp chirp behind all the static. Chirp, chirp. She's pretty close. You're not very far at all. Now listen to that chirp.
We walk through tall grass, not too far from the trap.
So that's where the direction she's not in. Now I'm going to rotate. She's not very far. She's less than a kilometer away from me. She's just where Grant dragged that smelly, stinky bait. No, she'll be she's,
little further.
You know, she could be around a kilometer away. That's a pretty strong chirp. When we're going to collect radio collars, when you hear a chirp like that, you're getting pretty close. So she's not far at all.
So why do you think I included that in this story? Any guesses as to what that was doing? No one? Okay.
Was it
Yeah.
missing the action?
Yeah.
It was like because like you said, in your direct or while you're in the field, you wouldn't get this out in a studio. You'd need to be there. So.
Yeah, exactly. So I could have like got Michael in a studio, and I could have been in another studio, and the connection's great, and I can hear him fine, and he can be like, "Oh, we track grizzly bears using telemetry," and that's like, it's not really that interesting compared to, "Oh, his field season's not over. Great, I'll just go out with you while you're doing all your work." His work includes using telemetry to find where these bears are. And so because I have that sound, it's like suddenly that sound is like a proxy for the bear, because that sound represents like how close that bear is to them. So it creates like a little bit of action, it creates a little bit of tension, it sort of helps drive the story forward. So I'm not just using this sound for the sake of it, it's not just like decoration, it's actually important to the story. And so the sound that I gather in the field, it's not an afterthought. I'm thinking of what role can this play in my reporting. And there's a lot of things I record that don't end up making it in because I've recorded them and it turns out they don't really fit into the story. Yeah. Okay, another approach I like to take is talking to people who care about the environmental topic or wildlife topic that I'm reporting on. And I lean on a lot of scientists as experts, but scientists are more than just experts. I have found, like, when you're talking to a scientist whose work, and you're nodding because you're like, you studied biology, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so, yeah, how would you describe how most biologists sort of relate to their work?
Like, especially, like, I've had my fair share of professors who, like, were obviously just kind of there to do research, but, like, the ones that, like, really, really care about what they're talking about and, like, really just want to, like, nerd out and share, like, everything that they really care about with you, it's, like, completely a different experience. And it, like, the fact that they care about it so much really gets you into it as well.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what I'm looking for when I'm talking to scientists whose work is related to the natural world, because I have found that very often there is that connection. They do care, and it's like really clear in how they're talking that they care. So this is from the Heart Mountains, again, from the same reporting trip, and I'm talking to a biologist named Claudia Copley. And when I was going out there, I knew that the reason that they're gathering insects and plants from these high mountaintops in northern British Columbia is because they want to document what's there, because the climate change is changing those ecosystems so quickly. And I knew that I knew that I could script some of that, but I also wanted to hear part of that from her. So in this clip, you'll hear me and her.
By lunch, our camp is in the valley behind us, out of view. We're surrounded by alpine meadow dotted with limestone. There are large patches of snow and ice, which seem at odds with the wildflowers. That snow and that ice are important to this ecosystem, but they're quickly disappearing. Climate change is a major threat to northern alpine areas, like this one. It's one of the reasons the biologists are so eager to get a snapshot of these ecosystems, because they might soon be gone.
The species that occur at these elevations are adapted for these cold temperatures. And if they live at the top of the cold mountain now, there's nowhere left for them to go when the climate around them warms up. So they won't have options in terms of their future, and they can't just move to a more suitable habitat because they're trapped in those high elevations that are only available in certain places. And British Columbia's got a lot of high places, but they're the most severely affected in our province by climate change.
Species here may already be affected. It's hard to know, since nobody has explored this area like this before. So it's important to understand what's living here now, so we can tell how much more it's changed in the future.
So every time something winks out, we don't know what all the parts do, but there's some loss that we eventually realize has been bigger and has impacted us. In some ways, you hope that you can make a case for people to make changes in their lives now, and so there really will be potentially loss of those species. And we don't know which ones, and we don't know how many. It's just a guessing game. Sorry.
So going in, I already knew what impact climate change was having on these types of environments, but it was really important for me to get the chance to sit down with the biologists and ask them about this. So just for some context, like we were sitting, just taking like a lunch break at the top of a mountain, and she's like looking out over this place that is changing so quickly, and she sort of like breaks down crying at the end, and that's why yeah, she sort of trails off. And I'm not saying that caring means like somebody is going to like break down in tears about what they care about. This is just an example, but you know, there's many ways for people to express like emotion and passion about the thing that they research. And this applies like well beyond environmental reporting. Like this is applicable for any of your reporting, like any of you who are here and studying journalism. You know, if you are doing stories about stuff that is not like people, and it's like, you know, you're getting people to talk about these things, like their research or whatever, tapping into that passion is a really helpful way to engage listeners.
By lunch,
Okay, so another approach I use in reporting on the environment is talking to different people and including different perspectives. This is a documentary I made about bison called Bringing the Bison Home, and it's about the reintroduction of wild bison in Alberta. The story I ended up making is a lot different than where my research started out. Originally, I'd heard about the efforts to reintroduce wild bison into Banff National Park, where I live and I report. And I went to this presentation, and because like I'm a bit of a nerd, I thought it was so cool to learn about how bison can actually change a landscape and an ecosystem. And then I was like, okay, well, that's cool to me, but like that has a pretty limited, like it may not necessarily reach a broad audience when people are thinking about, well, why are bison important? And so my research took me a little bit further, and I found that there were many Indigenous communities who are actively trying to bring wild bison back to their communities. And so I ended up visiting a community called the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. And so these are communities in southern Alberta and like northern Montana that are part of this like greater effort to try and bring bison back. And this is, so this is from my visit. I'm talking to a guy named Dan Fox. He's not a scientist. He lives on the Blood Reserve. He's Blackfoot, and he owns and runs a bison ranch.
This area here,
Dan Fox is completely at home on his ranch. He looks the part too, in his faded jeans fastened with a big brass buckle. Dan's Paulette's cousin. He's seen how the bison enrich the land, and he also feels their healing power in his own life.
This area here was really sparse and grass.
In this field, we're surrounded by the bison Dan raises for food and for ceremony.
That's the crunchy root. When they come through, they run through these, and they spread the little seeds. They'll go into the soil, and come spring, there'll be more and more. They're actually reseeding and replanting.
Dan shows me a dried bison patty.
This is about, I don't know, about a foot. You cut it open, you see all the holes. Those are the beetles that go in there. Then way back in the day, that was their firewood. I tried burning it in the fireplace, and it burnt all night. And that's what they used in their teepees.
For Dan, ranching bison is about more than repairing the environment.
It's physically healthy, keeps me emotionally strong, mentally sharp, and spiritually. It's made me a better man. I had an alcohol addiction. I went through residential school and went through all the whole 9 yards of the things that had caused the native people a lot of dysfunction. And when I started working and knowing about these animals, like the whole world opened up and blossomed to me. I appreciate just about everything of Mother Nature that's passed on to me. That's when I knew that this is where I was meant to be.
Okay, so he sort of like starts to talk about like, you know, what we're seeing and stuff, but what else do we learn from him? Anyone?
A little bit about his like personal life, how he had like he struggled with depression.
Yeah.
And kind of, you know, you dive into who he is as a person too, not just the cause, like what he's doing.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us like back to the bison, because that serves as like therapy for him almost, right? And so that's why I decided to share this story instead of just like a science story. about bison because I thought it was a lot more interesting for a wider audience to relate to, like, what do these animals mean not only to an ecosystem, but what do they mean to a community? And I think with environmental reporting, there's a lot of opportunities to think about where does this environmental story fit in? Like, what community does it fit in with? Can I talk to those people about why this is important to them? So who listens to Radiolab? Anyone here? Have any of you heard this episode, Tree to Shining Tree? No? Okay, great. Because if not, that's even better. So I really like to get scientists to tell a story. And the reason I'm sharing the Radiolab, the first 4 minutes of this episode is that they get a scientist to tell like a really great story. It is 4 minutes. It's a little longer than the other clips. And there's a bit of back and forth between the hosts at first, but I promise you the payoff is great.
I'd like to begin by building a tall, dark, dense green forest. Imagine towering trees to your left and to your right. I'd need a bird, a lot of birds actually, and a little wind. So
Do you mean
some
like
birds.
sound?
Sound, yeah. Birds, please. Birds.
Why? We haven't even started this.
What do you? Why? Like this is what you do. You give me like I want wind, birds,
I'm not
chipmunks.
I'm not like your sound puppet here.
But I can't. How do I? All right, never mind. This story
You'll get your sound at some point.
begins with a woman, or at the time actually, she was a very little girl who loved the outdoors, and I mean, really loved the outdoors.
When I was a little kid, I would be in the forest and I just eat the forest floor. And I know lots of kids do that, but I was
Sorry, but did you mean you got down on all fours and just?
Yeah, I would just eat the dirt.
This is Suzanne Simard.
And so my mom always talks about how she had to constantly be giving me worm medicine because I always had worms.
She's a forestry professor at the University of British Columbia, and we might as well start the story back when she was a little girl.
Well, when I was a kid, I grew up in the rainforests of British Columbia, and my family spent every summer in the forest.
And her family included a dog named Jigs.
And so in this particular summer when the event with Jigs happened.
What kind of dog is Jigs, by the way?
He was not a wiener dog. He was what was he?
You don't know what your dog was?
Not a basset hound, but he was a beagle.
Beagle.
Yeah, he was a curious dog.
And on this particular day, she's with the whole family. They're all out in the forest. It was summertime. And Jigs, at some point, just runs off into the woods, just maybe to chase a rabbit, whatever. A couple of minutes go by.
And all of a sudden, we could hear this barking and yelping, and we were all like, oh my goodness, Jigs is in trouble. And so the whole family and uncles and aunts and cousins, we all rush up there.
So they follow the sound of the barking, and it leads them to an outhouse. And when they go in,
There is Jigs at the bottom of the outhouse, probably 6 feet down, at the bottom of the outhouse pit,
oh dear.
where we've all been, doing our daily business. Fallen in, he's looking up at us, quite scared and very unhappy that he was covered in and toilet paper, and of course we had to get Jigs out. I mean, Jigs was part of the family. And
Since he was so deep down in there,
we had to dig from the sides,
to sort of like widen the hole.
basically expanding it from a kind of a column of a pit to something that's, we could actually grab onto his front legs and pull him out. And so we're digging away, and Jigs was, looking up with his paws, and looking at us, waving.
And they're digging and digging and digging, and then all of a sudden, she says she looks down into the ground and she notices that all around them where the soil has been cleared away, there are roots upon roots upon roots of this thick, crazy tangle.
We're sitting on the exposed root system, which is like, it is like a mat. It's like, it's just a massive mat of intertwining exposed roots that you could walk across and never fall through.
She says it was like this moment where she realizes, oh my God, there's this whole other world right beneath my feet.
Jigs had provided this incredible window for me, in this digging escapade to see how many different colors they were, how many different shapes there were, that they were so intertwined. It's as abundant as what was going on above ground. It was magic for me.
Okay, so what's the point of this story? Like, why do you think the episode starts this way?
To give her a purpose, like this is what led to her becoming what she eventually became. So it gives you a look into the background without saying, oh, why did you do it? No, it's like, tell us the story of why it happened, sort of along those lines.
Yeah, totally. It's sort of like, it would be like her origin story if she's like a superhero or something. Like, so like I imagine it. Like, because she goes, her whole career is devoted to studying mycelium, which are like those fungus that like connect from roots to roots under the forest, and they basically allow trees to communicate with each other, which is like kind of a complex story to tell. So to get people interested, Radiolab started with this really strong story to like hook people not only on the wow, like that's what's happening under the forest, but also Suzanne's like pretty charming, right? Like it's a funny story, it's pretty light. And so I asked one of the producers of Radiolab about the making of that story, and she told me that the opening scene is really important because it's one of the few bits of narratives that we had to work with, and we needed to use it to pull the listener into the show. It had to be quick, but it also had to be vivid and to give us a good sense of Suzanne as a character. So we'd be happy to listen to her talk for the rest of the episode, hence the eating dirt part, right? So it's not just like because they can, it's like used strategically as a hook. And so I like to ask scientists for stories about their work, like anecdotes or fun stories from the field, or like, is there a story behind your current research project or behind like your interest in this field? Sometimes it doesn't result in anything that I can use, but sometimes it does. And I think the Radiolab example is like a really good example of when it does. Have any of you been doing radio documentary or podcasting as part of your like program here? Yeah. Okay, so like a couple?
Just go like this.
Anyone else? Just like 2 or 3? Yeah. So have you done stuff where you've like interviewed and then you have to like take it back and like edit it and stuff like that?
We're actually gonna do it tomorrow.
Oh, awesome.
We're doing it tomorrow for our first time, yeah.
Oh, that's exciting. Because how much work do you think went into the interview for this like 4 3-minute story, based on listening to that?
A couple of hours, easy.
Yeah, easy. Like they would have had like, they would have had Suzanne in the studio and the hosts. They would have had a couple producers listening in, and like they would have had a question line. Like they would know that Suzanne already had this story, and they would have a line of questions to ask her to tease this story out, and they would be listening to her answers so that they could edit out some of those questions, right? So it sounds like this really sort of like, oh yeah, this is the story, but it, like a lot of thought goes into that, and it's like done very purposely. Yeah.
Are there any particular questions that you do for scientists to get those type of like scene or sensory details when you're doing like actualities like in the field?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. It's more like in my sit-down interviews with them, I'll ask stuff like, how did you get interested in your field? Like, how did you start in this field? Do you remember a time when your thinking about X shifted and it became Y, right? Like if they have like a really different view on something, like I'm just looking for those critical moments in their life where something changed, right? And that could be like, maybe it's a story about like how they got onto that current research project. Like I was talking to a scientist and she studies squirrels, and she like was out in the field and like noticed this really strange thing, and then she was like, oh, I wonder if, she has a way better story than me retelling it, but I'm just sort of digging, like I'm thinking about like the trajectory of their career and the trajectory of their current project, and I'm trying to like poke around for like stories about that. And then if they have one, it's like, oh, can you take me back to that moment? Can you walk me through that? What did that look like? What was the day like, in terms of like getting texture if they actually have a story? So like they do that here in the Radiolab piece, right? Like they're asking her a lot of questions, and they sort of tease her a bit because she can't even remember like that her dog was a beagle. So it's just like continually sort of like poking in and trying to get, like, knowing that someone can always dig a little further. I mean, when you think about if somebody were to ask you about a memory right now, you might not actually have that coherent a story about it, right? But if you kept talking it through and like they asked you prompt questions about like, how old were you? What was the weather like? Like, you know, do you remember like what, like, I don't know, like so many other sensory things. Like if you were outside somewhere, like did the flowers smell like something, you know, anything like that that brings up like a strong sensory connection. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So I just have like one more tip, and this is creative sound design. Is this something that any of the like sound people in the room have had a chance to play around with a little bit? Yeah. So creative sound design is a little different than when I was talking about sort of like field recording. If I'm somewhere like the Heart Mountains and I'm recording all the time, and then I'm using that sound and it's like, it's in reference to that particular story, right? Like nothing is sort of like creative about it. It's all like from the same scene. But sometimes things have happened in the past and you want to like bring them to life through creative sound. So this is the first 2 minutes of a podcast series I made for an online news magazine called The Narwhal. They make stories about the natural world, and this was their first podcast. It's about a celebrity grizzly bear. Those are a thing in Banff National Park. It's weird. I'm from Toronto originally, and so like moved to the mountains, and suddenly like wolves and grizzlies are like in the newspapers and celebrities. It's wild. And so this bear was really controversial, and I ended up making a podcast about this bear, which a couple of people have described to me as serial, but about a bear, which I think is very generous, but I'll take it. And this is the first 2 minutes. And I just want you to just like sort of listen to what audio elements you're hearing in this.
It's a Sunday in late September. A grizzly bear makes her way through a thick forest. She's near the Goat River. It's a tributary that runs into the Fraser River in British Columbia. In the distance, you can see mountains. This could almost be wilderness. But decades and centuries accumulated other uses, like gold mining and forestry. There's a village about a 45-minute drive southeast from where the bear is. Around her are access roads running through this forested area, and at least 2 people are nearby, a hunter and a guide. The bear walks near a forestry road. The people see her. Maybe she doesn't see them or smell them. Maybe she does, but she doesn't know to be afraid. Either way, it's too late. They shoot. Nearly 500 kilometers northwest of where she was born, from where she had lived since she was a cub. She dies here in British Columbia, near the Alberta border, just 2 months after being moved here from her home range. She's 6.5 years old when she dies. Her death is legal. British Columbia's trophy hunt will end in just a couple months. But for a lot of people, this grizzly bear isn't just any bear. She was called Bear 148.
Okay, so other than my own like scripting and like voiceover that you hear, what other things are you hearing? Yeah.
There's like music and sound effects that go along with what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So I could have just, I didn't have to add sound, but I decided to because I knew that all of the events I was talking about, like I could place this somewhere, like all of it was fact checked, but you know, nobody had been there and recorded her death. But I knew where it was, and I knew it was like near a river. I collect my own sound effects. I don't use like sound effects from the internet and stuff. Like I'm lucky to live somewhere that, you know, I can go out and record the birds and, you know, wind in the trees and a river and stuff like that. So I included some of that in this. And then I just a little bit. And then I decided to add music because I wanted to sort of set a tone. And the one thing I point out is that both those things, like creative sound design and music, are not appropriate in every type of audio journalism, right? Like I don't use those things for shows that are like current affairs shows or news shows, right? But there's some things like certain documentary programs allow that, and like podcasting, that's usually okay, depending on the type of podcast. So, but when you do have the opportunity to do it, it's a lot of fun. And I'm just gonna play one last example, and it's from a documentary I made for a program called The Doc Project on CBC, and it's a feature documentary about a wolf pack that was living near Banff National Park. So Banff National Park is huge. It's really, really vast. There's a lot of wildlife there. There's a lot of wolves, but this one particular wolf pack was living near the one spot in Banff that's like super, super busy. There's like 4 million people come through this town each year. So they interacted with humans a lot, and things didn't end well for the wolf pack. So I was sort of like recreating their story, and I wanted to tell the story of these wolves using some creative sound. And if you want, you can close your eyes and like listen, and I'd be so curious to know what you hear when you listen to this.
It's nighttime. A pack of wolves looks for food. One wolf guards the new pups at the den, their home. If you look closely, you might see a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. The wolf will smell its prey first, upwind, kilometers away. Elk, deer, sheep, moose. A wolf will know. They move closer. Wolves can see at night. They work in tandem to isolate a small elk from the herd. One pursues. Another finishes the attack. Today, a feast. But wolves aren't always successful. It could be a week before they kill again. For now, they must make the most of this.
Okay, so what did you guys hear?
The eating.
Yeah.
How did you get those chomping sounds?
Yeah. So obviously I couldn't record a wolf in the wild for ethical and safety reasons. So what I did was I used a lav mic. Let's see, this is like all tangled, but I used a lav mic like the one I have on. I borrowed a friend's dog, went to the dog park, because I wanted to create a sense that we were like in the wolf pack. So I didn't want to just record a dog like running around. So we got a GoPro mount. Have you seen the ones that you can actually put on a dog and it has the camera on the back? So we took the camera off, drilled a hole into the mount, and like attached the battery pack of a lav mic behind on the dog's back. Then like wound the lav mic around so that it was like placed on the dog's chest. And so if you imagine the dog's here, the mic's here, a lav mic, I don't know if you guys have used these before, but the recording pattern is omnidirectional. So that means if it's like placed here, I knew it was going to get the dog's legs as it was running, and I also knew that it would pick up the sound of like its breathing and stuff, and also the sounds of it like playing with like a stick and stuff like that. So that's what I did to like emulate the wolf sound, and I made sure I fact-checked with a biologist like what sounds do wolves make, what sounds do dogs make, what can I use, what can't I use, because like wolves don't bark. So, you know, I just had to be careful with things like that because I didn't want, in using creative sound design, I wanted to set myself parameters of like, I'm not going to, like, this is all going to be fact checked, even though it's like designed, right? Yeah, and so the sound of it like biting and like chewing, like eating the elk or whatever, that's like it playing with a stick. Yeah, but I was hoping that it would sort of like play a trick on the audience. Yeah.
What about the howling?
The howling, so one of my interviews in the documentary was at a wolf sanctuary. And so I was lucky enough to be able to record wolves howling there and like edit that into the scene. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm sure you can find like wolf recordings, you know, on like freesound.org and stuff like that, but I was really trying, for this documentary, I used like things that I had recorded myself. Yeah, so that was like the aim, yeah. Any other questions about this?
Podcasting in general.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you got into radio work.
Yeah, for sure. So after my undergraduate degree, I did a 1-year program in Canada in journalism. And about like 2/3 of my year was focused on radio and radio documentary. At that time, so this was like 9 years ago, I would have been like in the journalism program. And like podcasting wasn't even part of the curriculum back then. Like that's how much it's like taken off since then. So I learned like radio documentary techniques there. Yeah. And like then I went and I worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So it's like a pretty straightforward path. Yeah. And then I got into like doing environment stuff because I had moved to Banff to work making podcasts, and then started freelancing, and there was just like so many great environment and nature stories around me that it just was, just happened sort of naturally. Yeah.
When you are traveling somewhere to do a story, how much do you prepare ahead of time in terms of like, do you have all your sources ready before you get there, or are you ever like finding them on the spot?
It's a bit of both. So like with the Heart Mountains, so I played a couple clips from that, and it's the one where we like helicoptered in. I had phone conversations with, I think, most of the biologists that were going to be out there, like definitely 3 of them. Yeah, 3 or 4. 4 of the 5 I had background conversations with, so I could get a sense of like what to expect from them, to see how sort of like shy or apprehensive they were about journalists, because I was going to be spending like a few days with them. So in that instance, it was like, you know, there's only a set number of people there that I can talk to, so I sort of made sure I knew what I was getting into, because that's a long way to go. For the story about the bison, my contact was a woman named Paulette Fox, who's an environmental scientist, and she lives on the blood reserve. And she for like a day took me around and introduced me to people, and I interviewed various people. And so I didn't know going into that, like I knew why the community wanted to bring bison in. So like I knew there was a story there. I didn't know everyone I was going to interview in that case. And so I had some like background knowledge in general, but I didn't have pre-interviews already done with the people I was going to talk to. So it is a mix of both, and like you always want to be, I personally always want to be open to opportunities that come up, because like if something's interesting or someone says something interesting, you want to always have your like ears open for that. But it's also good to be prepared as well. Yeah.
So 2 things. First, I wanted to know like what kind of like led you to moving to Banff, and then secondly, I just wanted to know like what, like when you're living in a place like Banff, when you're like within nature. Like I know with the case of like Bear 148, it was like a community, like a famous person, like animal in the community.
Yeah.
How do you go about like finding stories to talk about? Like how do you go about choosing things to write about?
Yeah, so I moved to Banff because I got a job making podcasts for an art center. But I had known Banff National Park because I had been working in Calgary prior to that, like earlier in my career, which is like an hour and a half away. So I sort of like knew that it was like a cool space to like live. And then when I moved there, I guess like I just started noticing things that seemed like as an outsider to be kind of like funny. Like everyone being so obsessed with bears led to that documentary. The clip I played you from Michael Proctor in the Creston Valley was an hour-long documentary I did called Roaming Imagination, What the Stories We Tell About Bears Say About Us. And it literally just stemmed from my curiosity about like, it's really weird that bears make the front page of a newspaper here as like characters and like celebrities, and like, you know, what's up with that? Why are we so afraid of them and so obsessed with them? So some of it stems from curiosity, some of it stemmed from just like being somewhere where there's a lot of human-wildlife conflict and a lot of research happening. So some of my stories are very like research-based, and I'll go out for a day with like scientists who are doing work. And then for something like the wolves, the pack, they had been in the news a lot because they kept going to like a local campsite, and then wildlife managers had to shoot the alpha wolf, like sort of like the head of the pack, and then what else happened? They had to shoot a second one, and then a couple more like died on the railway tracks. So suddenly there were all of these events, and I was like, oh, that's kind of like, there's kind of a story there, and so. That's how I got that idea. But I had reported for like our national news in Canada, I had already reported about all of the wolf deaths, because it is Canada's sort of most famous national park, and so it was fairly high profile that for some reason this summer, like these wolves we couldn't keep these wolves alive, basically. So it's sort of a mix of things. And I think a lot of it comes from just like living in that space. Like I think if I wasn't necessarily living there, I wouldn't necessarily think of the same ideas. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious what you're working on most recently. And I'm also curious about like places that you've published, whether it was like more like through like CBC or if like you've ever done like freelancing, pitching, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I worked for CBC for like 4.5 years at various stations across Canada, and I was always making documentaries like on the side. So I'd be working for daily programs and then making documentaries. And then so when I started freelancing, I already had the connections to freelance for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And so they have a lot of shows that broadcast nationally and shared internationally on like satellite radio and podcasts and stuff. So it was pretty easy to do it that way. And then I started doing some stuff for NPR and then some podcasts. And then I had this project with the Narwhal that I pitched, the Bear 148 podcast. And so during the fellowship, I can't actually publish any work. So Bear 148 was one of my last major projects before the fellowship. I also went out with grizzly bear researchers in Alberta. They were capturing and collaring grizzly bears, and so I went out with them. So there is like a bit of a theme to my work, and I've been doing some research during the fellowship about our interaction with other predators. So I've been looking at like great white sharks on Cape Cod and stuff like that. Yeah, which is interesting. Some interesting overlaps in how people talk about grizzly bears. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You wanna go first? I just want to know, is it way more challenging to shoot outdoors, as opposed to a studio? Or, because I'm assuming that there's a lot of things, like you said, you can't prepare for.
Yeah.
So does that make it a lot harder?
It makes it challenging. I've definitely evolved like what gear I use in the field. So I used to use a smaller recorder. I now use this, which is like it's more for like making audio to go with like movies and stuff. This is a field recorder, but I could plug in 6 microphones if I wanted, but it's sturdy, right? And it comes in this case, but it being really sturdy and weatherproof and also having the multiple channels to record on like different tracks was the reason why I got new gear, because my other gear was like not holding up anymore. And it's why I started to use a lav mic in the field. I wanted like a backup for like a scientist. Sometimes I'm out and people are like doing work and they're moving around. And so I have my other microphone, but like sometimes they'll be too far away from that for it to record well. So I have started doing things like that, as well as like I got the big like blimp, because underneath, you saw that photo at the beginning, my large microphone. This is the microphone that I'm using, and then it's in that giant like wind cage, because so much audio gets distorted. Like the mountains are so windy, so I can't use audio that's distorted. So it is challenging, but I've found ways to like prepare for it and improve the quality of the recordings. But yeah, like it's definitely challenging. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Or, did.
What?
Did you have a question? Right at the back? Oh.
Okay, sorry, I just did a double ask.
Yeah.
Are there best places to pitch to as a freelancer for environmental stories in North America?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you thinking audio specifically, or also audio specifically? So, are you part of like the Air Media?
I'm on Air, New York City Public Radio.
Yeah. Okay.
Study Hall.
Okay. Yeah. One like good thing to do is to like keep your eyes out for like pitch calls. So I started freelancing for a show called The Pulse.
Mike and Scott.
Yeah. Have you worked with them before?
Yeah, they've done like 5 or 6. It seems like they're really good for doing like first time stories. That was my first, yeah.
Yeah. So like that, they are always looking for like environment stories. Yeah. I try and spread my pitches around. Like I have done work for science-specific shows on CBC, but I also just like think about what environment-based ideas can work for a general audience, right? So I'm not sure who else. I mean, you have like a lot of like public radio here in Boston too. I think it's, as a general rule, like you just have to keep pitching, because for every story that gets greenlit, there's so many that don't. Yeah, so it sounds like you're doing the right thing if you're sort of like keeping an eye out, but yeah.
Thank you very much. That was great.
I just have like one more tip, and I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just like really urge you, if you're embarking on your audio stories tomorrow, to think of everything you're recording as audio, and like it all matters. So it's not just like sound or interviews; it's all going into your like finished product. So like take care, make sure it serves a purpose, make sure it's like as well recorded and clear as it can be. Yeah, and have fun. Thank you.